Hello there, this is Debbie Armendariz, and I have a little video for you that I hope will help you make sense of the readings for week 2. So the first week of this course, we looked at what it means to be a reader. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of teaching reading in an attempt for us to think a little critically about who gets to define what it means to be a reader and what is the politics of that. So I want to start with a couple quotes from Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator and philosopher. He wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and his texts are considered foundational to the critical pedagogy movement. He was imprisoned and then exiled in the 60s and 70s, and then returned to Brazil, where he passed away in 1997. So here's what he had to say about teaching. It would be extremely naive to expect the dominant classes to develop a type of education that would enable subordinate classes to perceive social injustices critically. He also said, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. And then my favorite quote from Paulo Freire, it doesn't hurt to repeat here the statement, still rejected by many people in spite of its obviousness, that education is a political act. So here are a few timelines of the history of teaching reading that will help you understand how it is a political act. These two up here do not include any information about bilingual education, so I included these two. This one here is my favorite. That's pretty thorough about the history of bilingual education in the United States. So let's start, of course, in Syria. The Phoenicians there were clever enough to realize that we needed a phonetic alphabet. Prior to that, there had been a symbol word association, but with their alphabet, there was a symbol sound association. And then after the European invasion of what we currently call the United States, the first readers that we see are the McGuffrey readers. We would consider these ethnocentric, at least, and quite racist. Then came out Dick and Jane in the 1930s. They had a whole language approach, which was very uninformed. And by 1955, this guy starts writing this book, Why Johnny Can't Read and What We Can Do About It. So here we see the first pendulum swing from whole language into phonics. And what he was saying was that we need more phonics so that kids can really become code breakers. 2 years later, 1957, Sputnik is launched by the Russians, and of course, everyone in the United States starts feeling like we're falling behind. 1960s, B.F. Skinner came out with his behaviorist philosophy and started this idea that materials should be teacher-proof. The 1967 first grade studies funded by the federal government also helped us understand the role of instruction in phonics and phonemic awareness to help students learn to read. And then a whole series of approaches to teaching came out. The language experience approach, the reader response theory, and sociocultural learning theory came out. And in the 80s, under Reagan, this document was authored, A Nation at Risk, which highlighted more ways that the United States educational system was falling behind. In the 1990s, though, we started rejecting these kind of contrived readers and moved more towards literature-based basals. And then that's when Fontes and Pinnell came out with their guided reading materials as well. Okay, so then that's how we get to 1997, which is when Congress, with President Clinton was present there, Congress asked the National Institute for Children's Health and Development to work with the U.S. Department of Education to find out how to teach reading, how to raise achievement, and to focus on scientifically based reading instruction. This part is really important. You'll see why later. So the Institute for Children's Health really didn't have a whole lot of experience with education, but the U.S. Department of Education didn't have a lot of experience analyzing research. So together, the work that they came up with landed on these 5 pillars of literacy. They came out with their report in 2000. It was a 500-page report, And that's when Joanne put out her minority report, which you will be reading later in this course. Then in 2001, President George Bush announces that his policy will be based on the work of the National Reading Panel and these 5 pillars. And so in order to qualify for the grants, the $5 billion that were going to be awarded in grants, you had to show that you were aligning your instruction with these 5 pillars. And then, of course, No Child Left Behind also came through with all its craziness. In 2002, though, this was, I think, my favorite time in education. The Education Sciences Reform Act created the Institute of Educational Science. And the Institute now gave the Department of Education its own research statistics arm. In 2009, a few years later, the state governors and chief state officers started pushing for state standards that could be held across all states. So now we had a research arm. Now we needed some standards that could glue all the states together. And in the year after they came out, a couple of years later, 46 states adopted the Common Core state standards. Of course, they also became highly politicized. And as a matter of fact, 5 states unadopted them, and many states that had said they were going to be testing them decided they weren't going to be testing them. So let's go back to the National Reading Panel's report, and I want to give you a little background on that. It was comprised of 14 members. They all had other full-time jobs. It was a very short timeline of 18 months, and it was chaired by a physicist. Then a couple of organizations, big organizations with lots of experience in teaching, were not asked to participate in the panel. The International Literacy Association and the National Council of Teachers of English. So the report has been very criticized for not including those 2 groups. And although they were supposed to review, remember, 100,000 pieces, remember how I talked to you about the scientifically based research? Well, they decided that 99,500 pieces of literature weren't scientifically based, and so they really concentrated on just a few pieces. As a matter of fact, they concentrated on the pieces of research that supported their already preconceived notion of 5 essential processes in reading, which is phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. And I don't think anybody says that those are not essential processes. The criticism is that it omitted many other processes, concepts of print, word identification, quality literature, motivation, culturally sustaining pedagogy, linguistic diversity, teacher preparation, a whole bunch of other things. So you will be reading the Minority Report as well as a blog from Tim Shanahan. So I want you to know a little bit more about those. First of all, the Minority Report, again, was written by Joanne Yatvin. She was, at the time, the school superintendent of Boring, Oregon, and she refers to herself in her letter as the only member of the panel who has lived a career in elementary schools. So just so you know, there were other educators. Tim Shanahan taught first grade, and he was on the panel. But she viewed her her perspective as being unique and not really being supported by the work of the panel. She criticized it for 2 basic things: that it didn't include teachers of early reading on the panel or as reviewers, and that it only focused on a subset of important skills. Now, Professor Shanahan, he was the past president of the International Literacy Association, one of those associations that was not included or asked to review the work. He did have a leadership role in the National Reading Panel, and he chaired 2 federal research panels that were funded by the Institute of Educational Science. He's also a member of the English Language Arts Work Team for the Common Core State Standards. So his perspective is very broad, and I highly encourage you to go to his blog and sign up to get his semi-weekly updates. So here's a few facts that I think you need to know about the Common Core State Standards, just in case some of these politicized myths have made their way into your ears. First of all, they were promoted initially by the chief state school officers and governors, not by the federal government, even though the federal government did support states in adopting them. And I think that was actually what ignited so much criticism, is that they were supported by the federal government. Teachers were involved in writing those standards, and they were meant to solve a few problems, such as the variance from state to state, the fact that many states had very weak standards, including Oregon. We had very weak standards, and that 1 in 5 college freshmen had to take remedial coursework because upon graduating from high school, they were not prepared for college, and that many states had way too many standards. There was no way people were going to be able to teach all of them. They received immense pushback. In part, some people felt like they did not appreciate the fact that fiction and nonfiction were now to be balanced, even in the early grades. Some people felt that they were too rigorous and inappropriate for some of the young learners. And then the fact, as I said earlier, that they were backed by the U.S. Department of Education. For instance, in order to qualify for a Race to the Top grant, you had to demonstrate that your state had adopted rigorous college and career readiness standards, such as the Common Core. So these two items right here caused a lot of people to feel that the CCSS was an encroachment on this American tradition of state rights. So final thoughts about all of this. First of all, Freire was right. So each day you, as a teacher, engage in a political act, and it has the potential to upturn our current discrepant and racialized social and political power dynamics. So I will leave you with a quote from Jim Cummings, who comes to us from the world of bilingual education. He is a Canadian. He's done a lot of research and a lot of writing on bilingual education, and his quote speaks to one of the pillars that was not considered by the National Reading Panel, and that I believe has a huge impact on how students view themselves as readers and writers. He says, when students' language, culture, and experience are ignored or excluded in classroom interactions, students are immediately starting from a disadvantage. Everything that they have learned about life and the world up to this point is being dismissed as irrelevant to school learning. There are few points of connection to curricular materials and instruction, and so students are expected to learn in an experiential vacuum. Student silence and non-participation under these conditions have frequently been interpreted as a lack of academic ability or effort, motivation, right? And teachers' interactions with students have reflected a pattern of low expectations, which become self-fulfilling. I hope that taking a few moments to watch this video will help you in your preparation as a teacher, but also in your reading of the text for week 2. Good luck.